In this video, I want to talk a little bit about nutrient digestion and absorption. So you should have watched the videos and studied up on what's going on along the digestive tract. In this video, what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about the different types of nutrients and talk specifically about how they're absorbed and where they're absorbed. You can think of this as a micro version of a little bit of Nutrition 101. First off, I just want to identify the different types of nutrients that you get from food. Food nutrients can be generally classified into two broad categories. The first category are the macronutrients. Now, the prefix macro means large, so these are the nutrients that you need in large quantities. These are also the nutrients that contain calories, the nutrients that can be used by your cells to make energy, to make ATP. These macronutrients are the carbohydrates, the lipids, and the proteins. They're made primarily of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Proteins contain nitrogen as well. And apart from being able to be broken down by cells and used to make ATP, these nutrients serve as the building blocks. You're made up of the same things as your food is. You literally are what you eat. So carbohydrates are broken down and used to make new carbohydrates in your cells. Lipids are broken down and used to make the lipids your cells need. Proteins are broken down and their amino acids are used to make new proteins in your cells and tissues. The micronutrients are those nutrients that are absolutely essential for life, but you only need very small amounts. And these are the vitamins and minerals. The vitamins are organic molecules, and I mean the chemical definition of organic, not the Whole Foods definition. So these are the micronutrients that contain carbon. Vitamins are usually used to make a part of coenzymes, so molecules that are necessary for enzyme activity, even though they aren't actually proteins. Minerals are inorganic elements, like calcium, iron, iodine, potassium, sodium. And they serve a variety of different functions. Some minerals act as cofactors that help enzymes function. Some minerals contribute to body structure, like calcium building bones. Several of the minerals circulate in the fluids of the body as ions and are essential for muscle and nervous system functioning. Think about sodium, potassium, calcium ions. So obviously with calcium, some minerals can do multiple functions, can contribute to body structure, and serve as signaling ions. Now, all of these nutrients, in order to actually be used by your body, they need to get into the bloodstream, and that means that they need to cross the intestinal epithelium. And in order to cross the intestinal epithelium, they have to get across the plasma membrane of the epithelial cells. This diagram summarizes some of the ways in which substances cross the epithelial cell plasma membrane. So the plasma membrane is the barrier to diffusion. Remember, with the plasma membrane, you have this phospholipid bilayer, and the inner part of this phospholipid bilayer is hydrophobic, and that's the important part that acts as a barrier between the watery solution outside the cell and the watery solution inside the cell. So some molecules can cross directly through that hydrophobic barrier. Water can cross because water is a relatively small molecule. It can kind of just slip in between the phospholipids. Small lipids can also cross directly. They are lipid soluble, they're hydrophobic, they can just dissolve right through that hydrophobic barrier. And that's called simple diffusion. So simple diffusion, substances passing straight through the plasma membrane. Other substances can get through the plasma membrane without using any energy, but they do require some assistance. And there are transport proteins that basically will either act as little channels, opening up a passageway for substances to enter the cell, or will pick up a substance on one side of the cell and then release it on the inside of the cell. This is referred to as facilitated diffusion. To facilitate a process basically means to help it along. So in facilitated diffusion, it's still diffusion, there's no energy being used, substances are still moving from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration, but they're getting a little bit of help from proteins embedded in the plasma membrane. In the third form of movement, some substances require assistance and energy. And this use of energy, and by energy I mean ATP, this use of energy is what defines active transport. You're still getting assistance from proteins, but you're now expending a little bit of ATP to move something across. Energy is usually required if substances are moving against their concentration gradient. So from an area of low concentration to an area of high concentration, you have to burn a little bit of energy. Now, as far as how this applies to the nutrients, sugars are the breakdown products of carbohydrates. They're taken up mostly by active transport, some by facilitated diffusion. Fats are taken up by simple diffusion, although the absorption of fat is a little bit more complicated. We'll talk about that in more detail a little bit later in this video. Proteins, they're digested down to amino acids, and amino acids are taken up mostly by facilitated diffusion, some by active transport. Fat-soluble vitamins diffuse across in lipid droplets. So with vitamins, there are both vitamins that dissolve in fat and vitamins that dissolve in water. Fat-soluble vitamins are taken up by simple diffusion. Water-soluble vitamins are mostly taken up by facilitated diffusion. Mostly. The one exception is B12. B12 needs to bind to intrinsic factor from the stomach, and then that B12 intrinsic factor complex is taken up by active transport. The minerals are primarily taken up by either facilitated diffusion or active transport, depending on the mineral. Now, once nutrients get across the intestinal epithelium, they are taken up into either the capillaries or lacteals. Most absorbed nutrients are taken up into the capillaries. Capillaries are the smallest blood vessels. These capillaries then drain into the hepatic portal vein and carry those nutrients directly to the liver. However, there are some fat droplets that are made in the process of absorbing fat that are just too big to enter the capillaries. The capillaries can really only take in smaller molecules. Large fat droplets enter into the lacteals. That's why these lymphatic vessels are called lacteals. The prefix lacto should make you think milk, like the sugar lactose, which is found in milk. Like lactation, the production of milk. So basically some historical anatomist at some point took a look at the fluid in these vessels, saw that it was kind of a milky white because of all the fat droplets in it, and said, I'm going to call these lacteals because it kind of looks like milk in there. So here's what I want you to know about the nutrients. I want you to be able to tell me what the final products of digestion are, where each nutrient is digested, so where in the digestive tract. I mean, the small intestine, you've got everything being digested in there, but in the mouth you only have carbohydrates and a little bit of fat. In the stomach it's only protein and fat. So where does digestion happen? You should also be familiar with what enzymes break down each type of nutrient. So if you see lipase, you know that's breaking down lipids, fats. If you see protease or pepsin or trypsin, you know that it's acting on proteins. If you see Amylase, that's an enzyme that breaks down starch, which is a type of carbohydrate. So understand where the enzymes, what enzymes break down each type of nutrient and where they come from. I would also like you to be able to tell me how each type of nutrient is absorbed, especially fat, because fat absorption is kind of complicated because fats are hydrophobic and the fluids of your body are watery. So what I would strongly recommend doing as you're studying this material is preparing a chart. So just basically draw up, carbs, proteins, lipids or fats, and then 1, products of digestion, 2, where digested, 3, enzymes involved, and then absorption. First off, let's talk about the carbohydrates. The carbohydrates are also known as sugars, although sugars are really the more simple carbohydrates. There are more complex carbohydrates as well, including carbohydrates that your body can't break down, the fiber. So, carbohydrates can be either very simple, and these are the monosaccharides, where you have basically one single unit, one simple sugar molecule. And there are 3 types of monosaccharides. You have glucose, shown here. You also have fructose and galactose. If you put 2 monosaccharides together, you get a disaccharide. This is the disaccharide lactose that's found in milk, and that's made up of 1 glucose molecule bonded to 1 galactose molecule. Sucrose is another disaccharide, and that is 1 glucose molecule bound to 1 fructose molecule, and that's the kind of sugar that you find in table sugar. Refined table sugar is sucrose. You also have maltose, which is 2 glucose molecules joined together. And you find maltose in fermented substances. Lastly, you have the polysaccharides, and the polysaccharides are the more complex carbohydrates, where you have many sugars strung together. The main 2 polysaccharides that you should be familiar with are glycogen, shown here, which is a set of hundreds of glucose molecules all strung together and branching. Glycogen is how glucose is stored in your skeletal muscle cells and how glucose is stored in your hepatocytes. Plants store glucose as starch. So starch is a large molecule made up of hundreds of glucose molecules strung together, but it is made by plants. It's not something that's typically found in our body, but when we consume carbohydrates, we frequently are consuming a lot of starch. So potatoes and bread are very high in starch. The fibers, indigestible fiber, are also polysaccharides. This diagram summarizes the digestion and absorption of carbohydrates. So, in order for carbohydrates to be absorbed, carbohydrates must be broken down to the monosaccharides. So, no matter what form you're taking in a carbohydrate, it's going to be absorbed as glucose, galactose, or fructose. So carbs are always broken down to monosaccharides and absorbed as monosaccharides. They're broken down in the mouth by salivary amylase. They're broken down in the small intestine by pancreatic amylase, and there are brush border enzymes that take those simpler carbohydrates and finish the job of breaking them down into the monosaccharides. And then glucose and galactose are absorbed, co-transport with sodium. Fructose is absorbed through facilitated diffusion. Then they are taken up into the capillaries and taken to the liver by the hepatic portal vein. Proteins are polymers of amino acids. So proteins are made up of individual amino acids just strung together by the thousands, if not tens of thousands. And sometimes when you hear the term polypeptide, you'll hear that to refer to protein, and proteins are referred to as polypeptides because the bond that joins those amino acids together is called a peptide bond. So a protein and polypeptide is the same thing. The polypeptide is usually used to refer to a fragment of a protein. In order for protein in your diet to be absorbed, it needs to be broken down to amino acids. So in digestion, proteins are broken down to amino acids and absorbed as amino acids. And there are about 20 different amino acids. There are 20 different amino acids that the proteins are made up of. So the process of breaking proteins down goes something like this. The proteins are broken down into larger polypeptides and then smaller polypeptides and eventually to individual amino acids. Protein is not digested in the mouth. There's nothing in saliva to break down protein. But once that food bolus gets to the stomach, pepsin acts on the protein, and that's with the assistance of hydrochloric acid. Remember, the hydrochloric acid denatures the protein, kind of straightens it out so that pepsin can get in there and chop up the protein. Pancreatic enzymes act on those large polypeptides and break them down into smaller polypeptides, and then the brush border enzymes take those small peptides, those small fragments of just a few amino acids, and break them down to individual amino acids. This process, the fact that proteins are broken down to amino acids before absorption, that's why it doesn't really make sense to, say, take in a protein, a nutritional supplement that is a protein that's supposed to be acting directly on your brain or your muscles or your kidneys or something like that. Because all proteins are digested down to amino acids that completely lose their function before absorption. Now, if that protein is intended to act in the intestinal tract, then you might have some basis, but it loses its function. And then those you're only absorbing the amino acids, and then those amino acids can be used to rebuild different proteins in the body. As far as the path of absorption, amino acids are taken up through active transport with sodium. There are some very small dipeptides and tripeptides absorbed and broken down to amino acids in the epithelial cells. And then the amino acids are taken into the capillaries and sent to the liver. Now, to talk about the fats, we need to understand the nature of dietary fats. Most dietary fats are these triglycerides, and they're called triglycerides because you have 3 fatty acid chains joined to a glycerol molecule. So that's what gives you the triglyceride. Now, when triglycerides are digested, those fatty acid molecules are ripped off of the glycerol, and then both the glycerol and the fatty acid chains are absorbed and used by the body, and they're absorbed and used a little bit differently. This diagram doesn't show it, but you do have a small amount of fat digestion happening in the mouth and stomach. Because you have lingual lipase in the mouth and gastric lipase in the stomach. You have small amounts digested there. But you don't have bile coming in. You don't have emulsification of dietary fats until you get to the small intestine. So you don't really, the majority of fat digestion happens in the small intestine. You don't really get large quantities of fat digestion until you have bile in there to break up the fat droplets and make them more accessible to the pancreatic lipases, enzymes from the pancreas that take that triglyceride and break it down into glycerol and fatty acids and some monoglycerides, which is just that glycerol backbone with a single fatty acid stuck to it. Now, the absorption of fat is complicated because fats are hydrophobic. So, the fatty acids and monoglycerides, they're taken up by simple diffusion, and then they're recombined into triglycerides in the epithelial cells and packaged into these structures called chylomicrons. And then chylomicrons are the large fat particles that are taken up by lacteals and enter into the lymph. There are some smaller fatty acids, what are called short-chain fatty acids. That just means that they have a short chain of carbon atoms. Smaller fatty acids can be taken into the capillary blood, but the larger fatty acids and monoglycerides, they're packaged into chylomicrons and taken up into the lacteals. This is another way of looking at fat digestion and absorption. So here we're looking at the role of bile. So you've got emulsification by bile. And that is forming these little droplets called micelles. So micelles are basically fatty acids and monoglycerides packaged together with bile salts in the lumen of the small intestine. Okay, so micelles are only in the lumen of the small intestine. The micelles kind of ferry those fatty acids and monoglycerides over to the intestinal epithelium, where they diffuse into the epithelial cells and are recombined and packaged as chylomicrons. So chylomicrons are these particles full of fatty acids, cholesterol, some proteins, and these chylomicrons are exocytosed from the intestinal epithelial cells and drawn into the lacteals because they're too big to go into the capillaries. This chart is just basically one big summary chart of how carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins are dealt with by the digestive system. So it takes each region of the digestive tract and kind of describes what's going on with each type of nutrient. And then there's a little bit about absorption and how they get into circulation. So we've talked about the macronutrients, and I just want to add a couple of small comments on the micronutrients. First off, I'm not going to talk about digestion of the micronutrients because the micronutrients aren't digested. The minerals, they are absorbed as ions. You can't really break an ion down. There's no covalent bonds in there to be broken. The vitamins are joined by covalent bonds all over the place, but they aren't digested. Those bonds aren't broken. The vitamins are absorbed whole and undigested. I mentioned that there are fat-soluble and water-soluble vitamins. You need a little bit of fat in your diet to absorb fat-soluble vitamins. Vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin E, and vitamin K are all fat-soluble. Vitamin C and all of the B vitamins are water-soluble. So that's one reason why you can't completely eliminate fat from your diet and still have a healthy, sufficient diet, because you would be seriously hampering your ability to absorb the fat-soluble vitamins. These are some of the more common ions that are absorbed, minerals that are absorbed, how they are absorbed, and any factors that affect their absorption. And down here you've got the water-soluble vitamins, and vitamin B12, which is a water-soluble vitamin, but it's a bit of a special case because vitamin B12, remember, needs intrinsic factor from the stomach. And the fat-soluble vitamins, taken up by diffusion, they're absorbed in those micelles that dietary lipids are absorbed in. Okay, so like I said, this is kind of a Nutrition 101 micro version, light version, although in Nutrition 101 we do cover a lot of other things too. But after studying this video, you should be able to talk about the locations and enzymes involved in the digestion of the macronutrients. You should be able to identify the end products of digestion of macronutrients and talk about how they're absorbed, particularly focusing on the fats. And make sure you draw a distinction between the micelles and the chylomicrons. They're both fatty particles, but they serve different roles. Micelles transport fats in the lumen of the small intestine. Chylomicrons transport fats out of the intestine into the lymph. You should also be able to discuss a little bit how the minerals and vitamins are absorbed, including making a distinction between the water-soluble and the fat-soluble vitamins.